One reason that Russia said it invaded Ukraine was in order to stop NATO expansion. The idea was that NATO over the years had gotten closer and closer and closer to what is now the Russian Federation. And the Russian Federation didn't like what it called encroachment of NATO getting closer and closer and closer. And in order to stop this encroachment, and this is the narrative at least, it needed to invade Ukraine to fight back against this NATO expansion. Now, I don't agree with this narrative being the motivator that sent them into this war. I think there was a lot of motivators. I believe that Russian President Vladimir Putin is a hardcore Russian nationalist, and I think the ideology that motivated him to invade, of him calling Ukraine an artificial state, when you look at the speech he released and the article he released prior to the invasion, talking about the ideology that underpinned his invasion, saying that all of the post-Soviet states were artificial creations, that Ukraine could not exist outside of being an extension of Russia, and if it exists outside of that, then it had to be destroyed. These were, I think, Russian chauvinistic nationalist views that motivated him to invade. I believe that there's resource reasons. I believe that there's, wanting the access to the port in Crimea. I believe it's a lot of reasons. But the odds of Ukraine joining NATO at the time that they invaded in 2014 and 2022 were quite low. That doesn't mean that Ukraine hasn't been pursuing that. They are still pursuing that. But I think that there were other motivations involved. But I do think that at least partially that Russia wants to push back NATO. I think that for a bunch of reasons, including the fact that NATO was in part designed to stop Russia from encroaching upon the Western democracies, encroaching upon, at the time it was France, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Belgium, now democratic Italy. Now it is stopping Russia from going into countries like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, if they so choose, and acts as a giant countermeasure to possible Russian encroachment, which they did in Chechnya, Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Anyway, Russia wanted to stop this. At least that is one of the points that they put forward. So they invade. The invasion doesn't go as expected. But does that mean that it couldn't possibly still be winning the civilizational struggle as they portray it with the West, with NATO, with the Western coalition? When you hear all these reports about Western support for Ukraine possibly decreasing, and you hear about the reports of the expansion of Russian munitions production and the rationing that's going on both sides, but on the Ukrainian side as well, as aid from the United States has lowered to its lowest levels since pre-invasion. Is this invasion succeeding in beating back NATO expansion? Well, you can talk about public support for Ukraine. You could talk about, the different election results throughout Europe. But one thing I think we can talk about is just looking at the map of Europe and looking how the strategic positioning in Europe is changing after the invasion, in reaction to the invasion. And there is no better example of this than Finland, which is the newest NATO member state. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Finns dropped their historic position of neutrality, which they had developed after the Soviet invasion of Finland and the end of World War II, where Finland kind of acted as an intermediary between the two worlds, the West and the East, as it were. But after the Russians invaded Ukraine and they've thrown into question the post-World War II, borders of Europe, the post-Soviet borders of Europe, and they've thrown into question the European peace that had developed over time, starting the largest war in Europe since World War II. Finland's security was then brought into question. So the decision makers in Helsinki, after seeing the Russian invasion of Ukraine, knowing that historically Russia has invaded Finland before, in fact, the Russians invaded Finland and conquered land in the lead up to World War II. And the Russians had been violating Finnish airspace in the preceding years before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And the Finns were, They knew that they had a military to defend themselves. They had a big army that they could call upon in comparison to its population. They had a lot of artillery guns. But at the end of the day, security certainty is better than security uncertainty. And so the decision makers in Helsinki made the decision to apply for NATO membership. And considering that they were already largely integrated with NATO, the membership process wasn't as complicated as it was for a nation state like Ukraine, especially since Ukraine is at war and there's territorial disputes at the front of that war. So Finland joined NATO. Now, this had a bunch of consequences. One of the most pertinent consequences for Russia is that their border with NATO just got doubled. They have border NATO countries like Poland, if you include the enclave, the Russian enclave in Kaliningrad, Lithuania, again, Kaliningrad, Latvia, and Estonia. But now their border with NATO has increased and across the entire Finnish border, meaning Russia might have to dedicate more troops to that border. And when it comes to stopping NATO expansion and making it so that there's not a NATO border up at the Russian border, I mean, that's failed. There was already NATO states that were at the border with Russia in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, but now that border has doubled. So I would say that is a failure when it comes to stopping NATO expansion. But when it comes to Finland's case, this has gotten even worse for the Russians because the Finns have decided to give access to 15 military bases in Finland. This includes, ports. This includes, just military bases, airports, 15 bases where the United States can pre-position troops, base resources, things like air defense systems and stuff like that within Finland. And one of the bases that America has access to across this country is in Gotland. Gotland is this island right over. Wait, no, this is true as well. They are based in Gotland, but that's in a separate deal with Sweden. We're talking about in a second. They are also based in. I think there's an island here at the Gulf of Finland that they have a base that's going to be very useful to the United States that they're going to be able to position troops in. This is worrying for the Russians because this is one of the pitches that Vladimir Putin gave to his people. We don't want American military bases in Ukraine on the border with Russia. We do not want American military bases on the border with Russia endangering us and making it so that Russia's territorial sovereignty and its safety and security was at threat. But now, while these aren't American bases, American troops and military resources and NATO bases, now being that, Finland's part of NATO, are on the border with Russia, with American military resources and troops able to use 15 Finnish military bases in the country positioned against Russian military assets. So that's already a failure when it comes to stopping NATO expansion in my mind, but it doesn't end with the Finns. There's also the Swedes and the Danes. And as I was talking about earlier with Sweden, and I was talking about this island right here, the Swedes have also made a defense deal with the United States, giving the United States access to their military bases, including that island. That island I was talking about, that Gotland Island, which, it's, oh my goodness, I think I just closed the map, but it's important for a whole host of reasons. It's important because it sits smack dab in the middle of the Baltic Sea. So if the Russians wanted access to the Atlantic or to the North Sea, they'd have to get past this island. So it could potentially block any Russian naval attacks through the Baltic into the Atlantic and into the North Sea. It is a connected. It's not a land bridge. It is in between Sweden, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Denmark, and a bunch of countries. So it's vital to keep trade and logistical routes open between said countries. It's a very valuable military position, and the Swedes have given the United States access to the base on the island. By the way, I do want to mention that this island was demilitarized in 2004 and only remilitarized in 2016 after the Russians invaded Ukraine in 2014. In 2016, 2 years later, they placed their first garrison on the island, and the years afterwards, they also added an amphibious groupings and a mechanized grouping, short to medium range air defense systems, and now American military access where they can put their own troops and their own resources in the island, on the island. So this is something that's not good for the Russians and seems to be pushing this Gulf, the Baltic Sea, to be, well, not this Gulf, but the Baltic Sea to be basically just NATO lake. Sweden is also on the path to NATO membership, but is being blocked by the Turks over disagreements when it comes to the Kurdish minority in Sweden, which has deep political disagreements with Turkey, and it comes to the issue of Kurdish independence. But that issue eventually will be satisfied, and as I was saying, the United States is already making defense pacts and military deals with Sweden, so the United States is going to have access to their bases as well. But that's not it. We're not done with the Nordic countries. Denmark today has also reached a defense agreement with the United States, which, and you guessed it, allows the United States to use Danish military bases to house U.S. troops and U.S. military resources. And in 2021, the United States also made a similar deal with Norway. So within the range of, what was it, 2 years, from 2021 to 2023, the United States has gotten military access to bases in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland throughout the entirety of the Nordic countries. And not just like bases in the middle of nowhere that's just to check off a thing to say we satisfied the Americans. Important bases on the Gulf of Finland, in the Baltic Sea, ports and air bases that can house American aircraft, American air defense systems, American troops. And while the decision for Norway was already decided in 2021, and when it comes to the basing of American troops in Sweden, in Denmark and Finland, there's still some rubber stamping. I don't want to call it rubber stamping because the legislature does have a real impact on it. They could shoot it down if they want to. The legislature has to approve it in early 2024, I think, for the cases of Denmark or Sweden, one of the countries. But that is expected to pass, and this is expected to go through. This is a massive advance for American military influence in the region, advance for American diplomatic influence in the region, and 80% of it was motivated by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, that's my opinion, but when you ask the Finns why they joined NATO, why they made the decision to drop their historic neutrality, which has led to a diplomatic row with Russia, with the Russians trying to overwhelm the border with Finland, they will say the invasion of Ukraine. If you add the Swedes, they'll say the same thing. If you ask the Danes, while they're allowing all this military access, they'll say that it's the same reason that they're one of the #1 donors to Ukraine. I think they're in the top 10 as a percentage of GDPs, as they approve another $1 billion in military aid for the Ukrainians. If the goal here was to lessen the strength of the transatlantic alliance, was to push back upon NATO encroachment, it was to stop NATO from expanding its border with Russia, and to make it so Russia isn't being encircled by American military assets and bases. Well, this war has been a failure on that front so far, hasn't it? Finland is joining NATO, doubling the border with Russia, NATO's border with Russia. Sweden is joining NATO. Finland and Sweden are now allowing access to U.S. troops. Norway has already allowed access to U.S. troops, made a decision in 2021, but is finishing that process now. Denmark has also now allowed access for U.S. troops as it's funneling more weapons to Ukraine. The United States' relationship with the Nordic countries are stronger and deeper than ever when it comes to a military perspective, when it comes to a military integration perspective, with now American troops going to be on the ground in Finland on these bases for the first time. This is history in the making. This is real history in the making. And who do we have to thank for America's progression in the Nordic relationship? The Russian invasion of Ukraine.